All right, guys. So today we are taking a look at a really important, very big topic, and that is of colonial era slavery. Now, we're talking about a long period and a pretty deep topic. So we're gonna be talking in kind of general terms, but it's important that we kind of understand what's going on. So the very first thing that we're going to see is that slaves are going to first be used on Caribbean sugar plantations, right? So that's where the majority are going to be. However, they are going to be introduced to Jamestown for the very first time in 1619. Now, we've seen that before, we've talked about that before, but there's not an enormous need for slaves in the New World, or I should say in the North American continent, right away, right? Because we're struggling to find that cash crop. We're trying to figure out how this thing is going to work. After tobacco is discovered, after we find out how to plant it in large quantities and how labor intensive it is, then we start to see a greater desire for free labor. And so slavery is going to start to grow here because of that. But it was first in those sugar plantations in the Caribbean. Now, what we're also going to see is that slaves are going to come both to the Caribbean and to North America's British colonies via something called the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage is kind of a slave trading route from East Africa to the Caribbean and then on to the colonies as well. And it was absolutely brutal. Now, what we're going to see is that these slave traders are going and setting up kind of trading posts, so to speak, in East Africa. And then Eastern African tribes who are at war with one another are capturing enemy combatants, right? They're capturing people from the other tribes. And rather than kill them, have that blood on their hands and whatnot, they're actually willing to sell them or trade them to these slave traders. And so that's going to gain them some wealth. It's also going to get rid of a problem. They don't have to kill the enemy combatants. If they capture them, they can trade them again, get material wealth, and there's no risk of that enemy combatant returning to the battlefield or coming back to haunt them in any way. So there's that's what's going on in East Africa at this time. The Middle Passage was absolutely brutal, and here we see an image of kind of the way it would be situated, right below decks. This is very simply put and very crudely put, but it's accurate to say that they were human cargo. They were no better to these slave traders than cattle or any other livestock. And that's really a very unfortunate situation. But you can see, based on how they were chained together and chained to the floors, just how terrible these conditions would have been. They were extremely densely packed, confined below decks. Can you imagine? I mean, just think for a moment what the air quality would have been like, right? And how poorly nourished they would have been. It would have had rampant disease. And I see I've got looks like I ran out of number of characters there, but rampant disease. In fact, it was so bad that anybody that escaped, or at least if anybody ever got out of the bonds, it was not uncommon for them to throw themselves overboard because death was a better option. The other thing that we're going to see is that when they arrive in the New World, oftentimes they arrive with a high percentage of their human cargo, right? They arrive with a large percentage of those slaves already dead, having not survived the voyage, either starved to death or died of disease, whatever the case may be. Slave trading was so profitable that if they arrived with only half of what they set out with, it was still considered a really good haul, right? So they were willing to put people through these extremely harsh conditions in order to make them money. Slaves had, once they got here, what we're going to see is that they really had a very difficult time. Now, obviously, it goes without saying, right? We're talking about slavery. But they had a difficult time in creating community. Even though there were, a good and growing number of slaves, they had a difficult time finding a way to kind of bond together and create community. And that was for a few different reasons. One, these were people who were coming from all over East Africa, and so there was at least a chance that other people on plantations or owned by the same owner They might have had tribal conflict with that person. Yes, they're both in the same situation now. They're both being sold as slaves. But if they go to the same plantation, there's an inherent distrust there because they come from rival tribes or rival factions. There's often also a language barrier. Just because they come from Africa doesn't mean they speak the same language. There are hundreds and hundreds of different tribal languages and dialects and that sort of thing. So it's hard to create strong community when you can't communicate, right? The other thing is that they were often very closely watched. So all of these things together mean that's going to take some serious time for them to overcome those barriers and create a strong community. One of the other things that we see is that there's a lot of tension between African American slaves or African born slaves, excuse me, and American born slaves. And again, uh, where American born slaves probably have adopted English, they probably know the language now. Anybody coming over from Africa, there's that language barrier again. Many American born slaves had adopted Christianity, whereas African born slaves are still going to have that kind of tribal religion, whatever it may be, right? You also see that a lot of times American born slaves are, at least in some cases, really resigned to their lot in life. They were born in slavery. They never had a taste of freedom. And so this is all that they know. They don't fight back as hard. They're not as willing to run away. They're not as willing to be as disobedient to the wishes of the slave owner as the African born slave who had been born free and on another continent and who can't really abide by this idea of being a slave. And so, because of that, American born slaves were often more trusted. They were kind of put in charge. They become drivers in some cases, whereas the African born slaves often are seen as people who have to be subdued, have to be watched very closely, and so forth. And all of that creates tension between the African born slaves and the American born slaves. Again, there's already tension between different groups of African slaves for a variety of different reasons. Eventually, right? Eventually, slaves are going to overcome those obstacles. Oftentimes, it's going to take generations, but eventually they do overcome that, and in the long term, right? Looking at the long approach to history, they actually create not only community but really a deep and rich culture. We can look at that a little bit later, but just know that we're talking about slavery from 1619 all the way up through the 1750s, 1770s, right? So that colonial era, it's a long time. So we see some changes. And again, I want to point out that we're talking in pretty broad generalities. Now, slavery, as you can imagine, there's going to be some resistance to it. And there's really kind of three levels. Think of it as a pyramid, right? The very top of the pyramid would be resistance that takes the form of riots or revolts or physical acts of violence. Now that happened, to be sure, right? And there are some very well known and well documented cases of that, but it didn't happen with great regularity. And the reason is because they didn't succeed. And when they don't succeed, the punishment is extremely harsh. Slave revolts and rebellions are put down emphatically, no questions asked, right? It's just a death sentence. If you murder an overseer, if you murder your white owner or somebody in their family, it is a death sentence, right? So a lot of times, because the opportunity didn't present itself as easily and the punishment was so harsh, you didn't see that kind of top level of resistance. Now, kind of in the middle, although still rare, right? It's going to be less rare than revolt, but would be the idea of running away. If you could run away, then maybe you'd find yourself in what we might consider a slave enclave, a community of runaway slaves who are living together as free, and they could maybe find space to do that in certain areas, Florida, for instance, or trying to escape to Canada and different things. That happened, right? It certainly happened, but it didn't happen often. More often than revolt, but still, again, the punishment for that was extremely severe. Whippings, beatings, lashings. It was not a pretty thing, and it was very physical in nature. You could have food restricted. There were all sorts of different ways in which that could happen. you may be sold off, right, to remove you from, or even the idea of running away from the rest of the slave community in your area. There are a lot of different things that could happen, and most of them were not very pleasant, right? They were really very, very harsh. Now, the number one way, and it was almost universal, right? So we're talking about the broadest base of that kind of pyramid of slave resistance was kind of subversion. That's what we call subversion. And ultimately, that's just a good way of saying undermining slavery. Now, when it comes to subversion or undermining slavery, there are a lot of different ways that we can do it. And I got to tell you, as teenagers, you know it very well because you do it on a regular basis. You undermine slavery, or they undermine slavery by not working very hard or not working any harder than they had to. They might be driven by their masters or people who worked for them to work as hard as they could. But are they going to give it their very best effort? Are they going to put in 100% when they don't get to reap the benefit of their rewards or their hard work? No, of course not. Right. In the same way, you can kind of understand that, right? I think a lot of students maybe don't put forward their very best work. Uh, that is, unless maybe mom and dad are coming down on them pretty hard, right? Another thing that we're going to see that undermines slavery is faking illness or injury. If you can fake illness or injury, then oftentimes you could get out of work. You'd have to be laid up for a little while. They were going to care for you. They were going to feed you in order to nurse you back to health because they had made a monetary investment in you. And so it wasn't uncommon to see slaves uh, have injuries or maybe even fake injuries or fake illnesses. Again, that's something that I think a lot of people are well familiar with. I'm not going to lie. In middle school, I faked abdominal pain to the point where I was scheduled for an emergency appendicitis. I chickened out at the last minute. It was not good. It did not go good for me. But we fake illnesses to get out of school. They faked illnesses to get out of working. It was a way that they undermined that situation. The other thing that we'll see is kind of breaking tools or equipment, what we might consider sabotage. If they could break tools, then it cost the master money to replace or repair those tools. If they could break those things, then oftentimes they didn't have the tools necessary to do the job, and they would have to rotate in and out of work. There were a lot of different ways that they could do that, but all of those are subversion, right? And almost across the board, every slave was participating in minor acts of subversion. It was the number one way in which they could show their displeasure, in which they could ease their burden, in which they could kind of stick it to their master, and those sorts of things, which you're going to find all the time when people don't feel like they are getting the benefit of their labor, their hard work. So, anyway, that is the idea. By the way, don't. Again, in middle school, I was a moron, and I subverted parental slavery by sabotaging our lawnmower one day that I wanted to go out with my friends, and I had a job to do, and couldn't go out until it was over. And when my dad discovered what I had done, oh my goodness, I didn't subvert anything for quite a while after that. But that's kind of part of the human condition, right? And they were actively participating in those types of subversion. I don't condone sabotaging. I don't condone faking illness or injury. Just know that that was something that we probably can all relate to a little bit. Maybe you subvert the bonds of parental slavery, right? Who knows? All right. Now, the next thing that we're going to talk about, and really the last thing, is really the difference between northern and southern slaves. We tend to talk about slavery as a whole, and we lump it all in together. But the reality is, it's very different based on where you are and when you are. The northern states, right, meaning Maryland, that's kind of the Chesapeake Bay area, and everything north of that, right? That's the what we consider north, Maryland, and everything north at that time. Now, here's the deal: in those areas, farms were much smaller. They didn't have the large plantations. Again, this is a generality. That's not to say that there were no large farms, but most farms were smaller family farms. And so they didn't have large slave populations. They owned one slave or two slaves or maybe four slaves, right? And by the way, I want to stop and make a point here that the vast majority of people in the colonies did not own slaves. At no point in our history was everybody that was white a slave owner. That was not the case. It was only the top uh, of society. So, with that said, these family farms, people that could afford slaves, would often have one to four, maybe one to six slaves, and because they had smaller farms, they often did different types of work. Now, they would do manual labor and that sort of thing, but they were all often also closer to the owner's family, meaning the slaves at times lived in a cabin right next to the home, or sometimes if it was just one or two slaves, maybe even in the home, in slave quarters in the home. And so they became very close. Oftentimes, they were cooking the meals, they were educating and caring for the children, those sorts of things. So there is a closeness that develops, oftentimes between the families of the slave owner and the slaves themselves. Because of that, they're often more trusted. They're given greater responsibility, even to the point of at times, and again, not always, but at times managing certain financial affairs or being trusted with tasks of going into town and dealing with certain things, right? And sometimes they were even put in charge of all the farming operations while the owner was away on business or traveling in Europe or whatever the case may be. So smaller farms meant a smaller number of slaves were needed, and those slaves were closer to owners' families and therefore more trusted. Because they were more trusted, there was more integration into the white community or the community at large. So it wasn't uncommon to see African Americans, these slaves that were out there doing business on their master's behalf. It also wasn't terribly uncommon for slaves to be freed upon their master's deaths. Now, not all the time, but it was more common in the North, and therefore you saw a higher percentage of free blacks living in the North. There's a reason that abolitionism starts in the North, and it's because there was a different relationship between slaves and their masters and African Americans and whites. There was just a very different dynamic between them. There was more of a comfort level because their communities had kind of grown up close to one another, right? Integrated more so. Now, in the South, we're talking about Virginia and everything south of that. That's what we're talking about when we talk about the South. In the South, the farms were much larger. They had tobacco plantations. This is well before cotton, right? So don't think of cotton yet. That has not come into play. In the South, we had large plantations, which meant you needed a larger number of slaves to work the land. Because there were greater numbers in many communities, African Americans, these slaves, would outnumber the white population. And so there was a little bit of a fear of losing control. Large slave populations had to be looked after very very closely in order to make sure that things weren't going to go sideways. And so with all that being said, there was less trust. There was an inherent distrust of African Americans because there was a fear of disparity of numbers there. Oftentimes they lived, the slave quarters were nowhere near the white owner's home. They were out of sight. They were way on the kind of the back 40, if you know what I mean, like way back on the property. The owner's family would not have as close a contact, although there were house slaves. There were those that did cooking and cleaning and taking care of the children and so forth, but their lives were largely separate, right? Because their lives were largely separate, you did not see African Americans in town as much. They were pretty much confined to their farms, to their plantations, and to their slave quarters. Laws existed to keep things that way, to keep it very segregated. The laws were very harsh, and the punishments were very harsh. So you can see a very big difference between those in the northern part of the United States and those in the southern part of the United States, and how it developed very differently in terms of maybe how those parts of the country saw race and viewed slaves, and then later on African Americans, right? So ultimately, that's kind of how we're seeing things develop. It's an interesting study. Again, were there slave owners in the South that were more kind? Of course there were. Were there slave owners in the North that were extremely harsh? Of course there were. We're talking in very broad generalities to kind of get a better understanding of how it was for most slaves in each area. So anyway, with that said, that gets us through kind of slavery in that colonial area, at least in the broad strokes. So I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned something. Don't go sabotaging anything, and don't be faking sick. We'll see you guys next time.